Committee will come to order. Today the committee meets to hear testimony on understanding and deterring Russia. Events just over the past year, as Russia has consolidated its gains in Ukraine, has intervened in Syria, has continued to take unprecedented provocative actions against NATO ships and planes, all point to the importance of this topic and of making sure that we have the capability needed to protect the country, our allies, and our interests. That's part of the reason that the committee will again have hearings to explore the security environment we face, including threats and the current state of our military, before we hear from the Secretary about whether the administration's budget request answers those challenges. But I view today not only about Russia. In many ways, it does present unique challenges as it has the only nuclear arsenal, which it continues to modernize, that is comparable to ours. But other countries are also going to school on the tactics Putin is using in Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere. And I think we can expect to see more of these again and again in other places by other actors. So we need to understand the challenges presented by the only nation that continues to pose an existential threat to the United States, and we need to prepare for the wide spectrum of national security challenges posed by Russia and by others. Today, we are grateful to have three highly qualified witnesses to help explore these matters, but before I introduce them, I'll yield to Ms. Davis of California, who is filling in for Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to be here for Mr. Smith, and we certainly welcome him back just as soon as possible. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing this morning. Your expertise is a valuable resource to us on the important topic of Russia's strategic motivations, and I look forward to your testimony. Russian nationalism, as we know, has fueled a foreign policy marked by territorial aggression and expeditionary military activities. They have used enhanced capabilities and hybrid warfare techniques that have been instrumental in these endeavors. These developments are further compounded by Russia's noncompliance with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and its energetic policy of discrediting the United States, NATO, excuse me, and the European Union. So I'm very interested, as is the chairman, and I know all the members here on the committee, in your thoughts on what may be motivating Russia to be so adversarial and how the United States and its many allies can most effectively respond to the difficult security challenges Russia presents. And particularly, how might the $3.42 billion, which is included in the President's request for the European Reassurance Initiative, which actually almost nearly quadruples the prior budget request, how might that be employed to counter Russian aggression? Clearly, the United States must take a lead role in deterring Russia. I agree with Secretary Carter, who recently said, while we do not desire conflict of any kind with Russia, we also cannot blind ourselves to the actions they appear to choose to pursue. We must remain objective and clear-eyed about Russian intent, and we must be ready to contend with Russia from a position of strength and in concert with our allies and partners in the international community, should it become necessary. Thank you, and I yield back.
As I say, we're very grateful to have three highly qualified witnesses to help explore these issues. I want to welcome Admiral Jim Stavridis, currently the Dean at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, but just prior, our Commander of NATO and of the European Command. Dr. Evelyn Farkas, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Also some experience, I understand, over on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and we'll try not to hold that too much against you. And Dr. Fiona Hill, Director of Center on United States and Europe at the Brookings Institute, and also the author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, which a lot of people talk about. Again, thank you all for being here. Without objection, your full written statement will be made part of the record. Dr. Hill, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Smith. It's a great honor to appear here in front of the committee, and I'm very privileged to be here with such distinguished colleagues. I will just touch on a few highlights from my written statement and also offer some supplemental information to that written text. Mr. Chairman, as you have outlined, and Ms. Smith, as you have also underscored, it's extremely important, first of all, for us to understand the nature of Russian decision-making. Russia is not the Soviet Union of the Cold War. We no longer have a Politburo or a Communist Party or central planning. Russia is also not the weak military power of the 1990s and 2000. Power in Russia today is very informal, and it's rooted in networks around President Vladimir Putin. There are no significant checks and balances on Putin's presidential power, and so Putin himself is one aspect of the Russian challenge. However, waiting Putin out is not going to be a long-term strategy for us, because even if Putin were to disappear tomorrow, the likelihood of this is that he would be replaced by someone from within his inner circle. The inner circle of power around Putin is a very tight group of the same age range, and people whose professional and personal relationships date back decades. Everyone around Putin shares the same convictions, so he's not an anomaly. I do want to touch upon for a few moments, however, about Putin's particular style of leadership. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for mentioning my book. It's always a great delight when somebody does something like that. But the point of writing this book was to point out and to underscore that Putin is a professional Secret Service operative. He is very unusual among world leaders at present. He's been trained, as he puts it, to work with people and work with information. And this means that as president, he personalizes all of his interactions, both in Russia domestically and in terms of foreign policy, just as he would have done as a KGB agent when he targeted, recruited, and dealt with other agents and intelligence targets. Putin's also been trained to conceal his true identity and intentions at all times. This is what makes him particularly difficult to deal with. As the Russian head of state, he has a very great tactical advantage. He always keeps his options open so he can adapt to changing circumstances and he can continue to pursue his goals. And he knows that if no one else knows what he wants or how he's going to react, he can stay one step ahead of all of his political opponents, including the United States and NATO. In terms of his political convictions, however, Putin is a very traditional, conservative Russian politician. And there's a general consensus in Russia right now, deeply rooted in the political elite since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the current world order, including the European security order, disadvantages Russia. Russians see their state as one of just a tiny number of world civilizational powers, like China and the United States, and they believe that this means that Russia should have special privileges internationally, especially in Europe. So this is just to underscore that any successor to Putin, no matter who this is, would be just as staunch a defender of what they see as Russian interests as Vladimir Putin is. I also now want to turn to the nature of the current presidency under Vladimir Putin. Since the wars in both Ukraine and Syria, Putin has transformed his presidency into what we might call a wartime presidency. There's been a high command, centralized military and political command set up inside of Moscow, and all critical security and political issues are fed into a small group of people around Putin there who are the security team, what we might call the hard men of Russian politics. To be honest, we don't really know what happens within that group, how deliberations take place, how information is passed to Putin, and really who decides on what course of action. But what we do know is that most of the people in this group share the same operative perspective as Putin does. They come from very similar backgrounds, and as I mentioned, they have the same convictions. None of these hard men of Russian politics, for the purpose of this hearing, we should bear in mind, are actually military men. Even the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, who used to be the Minister of Emergencies, doesn't come from the military. The only person in this inner circle who does come from the Russian military is Gennady Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, but he is a newcomer to the inner circle of Putin's power. Before today's wars, the turning point in our relationships with Russia was the August 2008 war with Georgia. This was also a turning point for Putin and his security team. It was a decisive moment for Russia in understanding their relationship with the West. Moscow closely observed the reactions and political responses of the United States and NATO and European powers to the war, and they took the lack of US and NATO military support for Georgia and all of the disagreements about appropriate countermeasures as a sign that they could exploit fissures in the future. They also analyzed the performance of their own military to decide on the course of Russian military reform. The key lesson of the war in Georgia in 2008 for Russia was that no other European state was willing to engage in a similar military adventure to take Russia on. Since the Georgia War, the Russian military has become a direct instrument of policy for Putin and his inner circle. They seek to figure out how to deploy it against opponents in foreign policy for tactical effect. This gives Russia a great advantage, and it also makes Moscow think that it can take a lot of risks. So just to underscore again, Putin and his inner circles think of the Russian military as an operational tool. They experiment with the direct or threat of direct application of military force, including the strategic and tactical nuclear forces, to see what advantage they can gain. However, I just want to point out before handing over to my colleagues that the Russian military has several shortcomings as an operational tool. Russia's military modernization over the last decade has been beset by planning difficulties. Essentially, the reform of the armed services began in 2008, but it wasn't until 2011 when Russia began its rearmament program and the revitalization of its defense sector. So when the operations were launched in Crimea and then in Ukraine in 2014, the Russian military was not quite ready for prime time. This is one of the several reasons why the war in the Donbass was launched as a covert operation. And it's also been the case that the war in Ukraine has been seen by the Russian military as more of a proving ground, as an exercise base for the future. And since the outbreak of the crisis in Ukraine, we've seen the Russian military engaged in a series of large-scale and snap exercises. Indeed, there are exercises going on as we meet today. February is, in fact, the traditional exercise season for Russia because the annual draft comes up next month in March, which means that they'll have reduced capacity as the conscript force turns over. So Putin's challenge currently is to figure out how to maintain the military momentum that Russia gained in Georgia in 2008 and to keep on figuring out how to take the West, the United States and NATO by surprise, as they have done in Ukraine and Syria. One of the questions that we have to address today in the hearing is whether Russia may be reaching the limits of its ability to apply the military as a direct operational tool in future conflicts. In Ukraine, we see an effort to dampen down the conflict. There's discussion right now about the future of negotiations with the Minsk agreement. Part of this is because the Russian military has found itself squeezed as a result of international sanctions and the economic downturn, and also by the conduct of the campaign itself. The military budget has been squeezed by the reduced prices from energy and the revenues in the budget, and also because the state now has lower capacity for replacing the armaments and materiel that have been expended in the war in Ukraine. The Western sanctions hit Russia in 2014 just as the rearmament program was trying to reach its stride. Russia's been denied access to critical foreign technology as well as further revenues. And the intervention in Syria may be more costly than Russia basically admits at the moment, because the Syrian government is also not paying for the weaponry that it's receiving from the Russian government. So it's not just the costs of Russia's own military expenditures in the war in Syria, but also what it is also expending on behalf of the Syrian government. So Russia's dilemma is now one of prioritization. Where to allocate its budget and where and how to deploy its relatively limited trained manpower. The Russian military is still absorbing the effect of economic decline on the resources that they have. And for Russia and the Putin team, being at war in the Middle East is actually unfamiliar territory. Russia's goal in Syria is to consolidate Assad's regime to make sure that something stays in place until there is a better arrangement for keeping the Syrian state together. But intervening in Syria has been a very risky proposition. And to achieve the goal of keeping Assad in place, Putin requires large numbers of other players, not just the United States and European allies, to play along with Moscow at the negotiating table, as well as trying to head off operational setbacks, which will be inevitable on the ground in the Middle East. At this particular point, it's not clear how hard it will be for Russia to keep up the momentum that it has in Syria. Just to wrap up, with the economic downturn, Putin and his inner circle are under considerable pressure to keep on delivering foreign policy victories. These victories so far have boosted the Russian public's ratings of Putin's political performance. We have to bear in mind that with this highly centralized nature of Russian power, everything within the current system depends on the maintenance of President Putin's charismatic authority and his record as a leader. If the Russian people lose their faith in Putin as president, then the political system risks becoming destabilized. Putin's ratings are still very high. They would be very enviable in any context, but they're just a few percentage points short of 90% in the most recent polls. We have to remember that's also because of his record as president, but it's also in large part because of the siege mentality that we have in Russia today. Russians genuinely believe, this is reflected in polls, not just at the elite level, but at the public level, that we are out to get them in the United States and in the West. And although the Russian economy and the state budget have taken a beating since 2013, it's the wars which have deflected Russian public attention away from economic and political demands. Putin and his team have been able to blame all of Russia's woes on the United States and on Western actions and sanctions. Putin has shown he's been willing to pay a high economic and diplomatic price as he seeks to tip regional balances of power in Europe and the Middle East in Moscow's favor. But the question is, for how long? Can Putin keep the population mobilized behind his presidency if things start to go badly wrong for the military operation in Syria? You can be sure if we are asking this question, then Vladimir Putin and his team also are. So just to conclude, Putin's overriding strategy and his overriding goal right now is to secure security for Russia and his system and to press forward with his interests. We're talking today about deterring Russia, but Putin and his security team are also trying to deter us, the United States and NATO, from intervening in any way militarily against Russia in any of the conflicts in Ukraine or in Syria. Putin cannot anymore afford the resources for the mass army total mobilization approach that the Soviet Union adopted during the Cold War to defend itself. So the whole of Russia's military modernization program has been geared towards a combination of conventional, nuclear, non-conventional, and non-military means, this so-called hybrid means of defense. Putin has also, as I mentioned at the beginning, tried to instrumentalize the idea of Russian military force to show us that he intends to use it. This also means that he has to show that he will use nuclear weapons under some contingency. These are the ultimate deterrent, but they're not much use of a deterrent if you don't believe that anyone is prepared to use them. This is why there's so much signaling about nuclear weapons, as I'm sure we'll hear from Dr. Farcus and Dr. Stavridis. So the goal for Putin is also to push away the United States and NATO, not to actually exchange in any nuclear or military exchange. This means that it's very tricky for us to both take on board the nature of Russian threat perceptions and also to devise for ourselves coherent strategies and policies for dealing with the Russian threat. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Dr. Farkas?
Thank you very much, Chairman Thornberry, Congresswoman Davis. It is indeed an honor to appear before the sister committee of the Senate Armed Services Committee, where I served as a professional staff member from 2000 to 2008. It's also an extra honor to appear beside my former boss, Admiral Stavridis, whom I hold in the highest esteem, and of course one of our foremost experts on Russia, Dr. Fiona Hill. So thank you very much. I'll get right to the point. Russia poses a geostrategic threat to the United States and our interest. Indeed, last week, as we all know, Secretary Carter listed it first among the threats faced by our country. It is unfortunate, and in the 21st century to have Russia and the United States opposed to one another on fundamentals and most foreign policy issues. But the reality is that the Russian government is pursuing policies that run counter to U.S. national security interests and values. The Kremlin objectives are clear, and I have about 5 of them that I'll run through quickly. First of all, to retain President Putin's position as the leader of the Russian Federation, preserving the autocratic political system and mafia-style crony economy that together comprise Putinism. Second, to restore Russia's status as a great power. Third, to rewrite the international rules and norms to prevent intervention in states to protect citizens. Fourth, to maintain political control of Russia's geographical periphery, and by that I mean Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And if possible, to break NATO, the European Union, and transatlantic unity. Now, we've seen what Russia can do even with its unfinished military modernization in advancement of these objectives. And since we can expect President Putin to be reelected in 2018 for another 6 years, we can't wish this problem away. We must use all elements of national power, diplomatic, economic, informational, and military to pressure Russia to reverse course. The United States must counter and resist Russia's actions through a combination of deterrence, strengthening our allies and partners, and communicating the truth about the Kremlin's actions to the world. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to focus on the military recommendations, and we can talk about the other ones, diplomatic, economic, et cetera, in the Q&A. Because obviously for this committee, the focus is on the military. We must deter Russia from further military action. It's very important. And I therefore enthusiastically applaud the President and Secretary Carter's decision to more than quadruple down on the European Reassurance Initiative to establish a true deterrent to Russian military action against NATO. Congress should also urge the Pentagon to provide an aviation brigade to support the Armored Brigade Combat Team. And I can talk more about this again in the Q&A. On the non-NATO periphery, Congress should continue to support beefing up security assistance to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova in particular. They need more training, they need help with defense transparency and accountability, and we should provide all three countries with anti-tank weapons, which will provide them with the potential to deter the larger, more ready Russian forces. In Syria, we must get our allies engaged on the battlefield and provide equipment and other support to the Syrian opposition. If we do also succeed in finding economic and other leverage, and I mentioned some of that in the written testimony, this could also mitigate the need for more fighting, but more fighting is unavoidable right now. The Defense Department should no longer do business with Russia. This means no rockets used by the U.S. defense industry should be Russian, and we should establish a new foreign military assistance fund to help allies and partners throughout Europe and Afghanistan transition from Russian to U.S. military equipment. We must be united with our allies and partners worldwide and resolute towards Russian bad behavior. We need not enter a new Cold War or an across-the-board standoff with Russia. Where the Kremlin is open to cooperation and there are mutual interests, of course, we should work with Moscow. But we should know that Russia will not work with us unless the Kremlin sees it in their national security interest or we have sufficient leverage to force a change in Putin's approach. We need leverage to succeed in negotiations. If we take the actions described in my testimony, and as I mentioned, I go into more detail in the written, we will raise the price to Putin for achieving his international objectives. Russia will be forced to reconsider its approach. Then perhaps the pent-up and misguided human resources of the Russian people can be directed towards a future. And we will have successfully managed what is currently the greatest geostrategic threat to U.S. national security interests. Thank you.
Thank you. Admiral Stavridis, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Davis, please also pass my best wishes on to the ranking member. It's a pleasure to be back in front of the HASC. I've testified here many, many times over the years, both as U.S. European Command, NATO commander, and before that as commander of U.S. Southern Command. But today I'm here in my personal capacity. I'll kind of draw on some of my research and work as the dean at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and also some work I'm doing at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. I'll begin by saying that the top global challenge I see for the United States today is, in fact, the European problem. And that constraint is made of refugees coming in, economic challenges, but a big portion of it is the overhang from Russia. And I think that for the United States, our best pool of partners are going to be the Europeans. And if they are facing this challenge from Russia, as you've heard outlined so well by Dr. Hill and Dr. Farcus, that has significant implications for the United States. There's good news about NATO. Let's face it, it is 28 nations, 50% of the world's GDP, and a significant defense spending, probably $900 billion in total, 600 from the United States, 300 from Europe. So there's a lot of capability in NATO today, but the spending is declining. Our European allies are only spending about 1.4% of their GDP, well under the NATO goal of 2%. And at the same time, as you've heard outlined, particularly by Dr. Farcus, but as well by Dr. Hill, we're seeing Russia doubling down on a military approach. Russian defense spending is going up, even given the constraints of the fall in oil prices and the general global slowdown in the economy. Their defense spending has risen 25% in just the last 2 years. Today they have about 1 million men and women under arms, most of them conscripts, 2 million reserves, 270 significant warships, thousands of military aircraft. They remain a very significant military power who continues to improve their forces in very specific areas. So we need to be very cognizant of the challenges there, and when we couple that capability on the part of Russia with demonstrated intent to use it in Georgia, in Moldova, and of course, most dramatically, in Ukraine, followed by the annexation of Crimea, something that, frankly, I could not have imagined happening when I was the NATO commander just several years ago. So when you couple capability with demonstrated intent to use it, and its position alongside our greatest pool of allies, you see the significance of this challenge. A subset of this, I think, is the Russian cleverness in approach of how they are using military force. Some have called this hybrid warfare. It's a mix of special forces, information warfare, cyber, an area in which Russia is demonstrating extremely accelerated capability, and this element of surprise, building real ambiguity into their maneuvers. Very concerning. So when we put all of that together with these SNAP exercises, and as Dr. Hill mentioned, we're going to see this pattern repeated, and most recently, and neither of my colleagues have mentioned this, we see significant studies being done. I'll cite one by RAND, which just emerged, that indicates the Russian ability to sweep into the Baltic capitals in really a matter of days. 60 hours is the number that was used. I participated in a recent war game exploring this, and I believe this is an accurate assessment. So what should we do about it? Well, you're going to have an opportunity, of course, to talk to my successor, General Phil Breedlove, in the coming weeks. I'm encouraged by the increase in defense spending to focus on Europe. As Representative Davis reminded us, this is almost quadrupling. But let's face it, it's from a relatively low baseline. We've withdrawn troop brigade combat teams over the last few years. We should strongly consider returning those to Europe. And I think Dr. Farcus has hit the correct mix. Aviation, armor is what's going to be needed. As I look at the situation overall, I think NATO has the long-range capability, but in the short term, we face real challenges from Russia. So fundamentally, I think we need to continue to maintain a posture of deterrence. We need to use sanctions and continue to strengthen those as we look at Russian behavior. We need to maintain our own nuclear deterrent. Unfortunately, that's going to be part of this equation. And I think we need to reassure our allies in Europe, because by reassuring them, we can hopefully encourage increases in their own defense spending, which is their responsibility, to put alongside our good work in Russia. I'll close by echoing something Dr. Farkas said, which is we don't need to stumble backwards into a full-blown Cold War. That is in nobody's interest. But I believe we should cooperate where we can in places like Afghanistan, counter-piracy, counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, but we must confront where we see the need to do so. I think today, when I look at Russian behavior broadly and globally, to include Syria, where they're supporting a reprehensible regime, I think we do need to confront. And that includes significant deterrence, and the good work of this committee, its support of the armed forces of the United States, will enable us to be a strong partner in doing so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There are a lot of issues one would like to pursue. I'm going to try to limit myself to just a couple that focus on our responsibilities and what sort of military capability we ought to help build to deal with the situation that the three of you have described. Later this week, our Strategic Forces Subcommittee has a hearing on our own nuclear deterrent. And Admiral, you just mentioned the importance of that as one of the elements. Can you and perhaps others describe the role of nuclear weapons in Russia's thinking and then how that translates to what we should be focused on? Because I think a lot of Americans don't realize that Russia continues to modernize its nuclear stockpile. It continues to manufacture new weapons with different characteristics. Meanwhile, we're sitting here trying to keep the 1980s versions working. So the role of nuclear deterrence in this broader context is what I'm trying to understand.
Sir, as you know, today Russia maintains about 1,500 strategic warheads, about 1,000 in reserve, probably 2,000 to 3,000 tactical nuclear weapons. It's a significant stockpile. As you indicated, is being modernized. The United States maintains some level to meet that, and that mutual assured destruction philosophy will continue to matter at the strategic level. What concerns me in Europe, as Russian forces are not as strong as they were during the Warsaw Pact days, you see a potential, and we are reminded of it fairly frequently by President Putin, of the use of nuclear weapons in matching NATO forces. So it is the Russians who have indicated a reminder to us, and here I think we're really looking at intermediate nuclear range missiles as well as the tactical nuclear devices. So I think, unfortunately, this is a significant resource constraint, but it is necessary to modernize these in order to meet Russian challenges. I think Dr. Hill probably has some expertise on this as well.
Well, if I can just add to that, I agree wholeheartedly with the Admiral. Obviously, it's important for us to maintain our nuclear deterrence with Russia. They absolutely rely on their strategic nuclear forces to maintain their status, frankly, as a global power. But given their conventional weakness relative to us, they also place, unfortunately, too much emphasis on their tactical nuclear weapons. And under President Putin, they've actually refined their military doctrine such that they permit a nuclear first use against a conventional attack. So in response to a conventional attack against Russia, if the Russian government deems it a threat to the existence of the state, which of course is in the eye of the beholder or the leader, if they deem it a threat to the existence of the state, even if it's a conventional attack, they can use tactical nuclear weapons to respond. And that is a very dangerous development, especially given the fact that they've been making these very loose comments, this loose nuclear rattling, saber rattling comments coming from the Kremlin, coming from their ambassador in Copenhagen and elsewhere. So I think we're quite worried about that. And they also have a doctrine whereby they believe that they can deter the United States and other countries from intervening in an ongoing military operation, say against a NATO ally or against some other country, by escalating in order to then, they say, de-escalate. And the de-escalation would mean if they escalate, the opponent, say the United States, we want to come help our allies, we would say, oh, this escalatory attack coming from Russia, whether it's cyber, tactical nuclear, you name it, that is too much for us to respond to. We don't want to escalate, so we de-escalate in essence and let the Russians do what they would like to do. So it's a bit complicated, and I probably went a little bit into the weeds of the Russian doctrine, but I think it gives you a sense of how dangerous the situation is right now, because unfortunately the Russians really are relying on their tactical nuclear weapons to an extent that we find alarming in the United States. And the only other thing I would mention before I turn over to Dr. Hill is of course, we're also watching very closely the INF development, the intermediate nuclear forces, and the fact that the Russians have violated that treaty. And as I mentioned in my written testimony, I believe that the United States needs to be prepared to deploy, unfortunately, intermediate nuclear weapons back to Europe if the Russians do not roll back their program. Thank you.
Just to add to this, this is the area that we should be paying the most attention to when we're trying to figure out the Russian approach. As we've been making clear, they're talking about tactical and intermediate nuclear weapons here. which is something quite different from the strategic nuclear arsenal that we've been trying to address through the New START treaty, which still seems actually to be holding in place. But it's that whole element of tactical surprise which is key right now to the military momentum that Putin and the team around him have been trying to build up since the war in Georgia in 2008. The whole point of everything that we have seen has been to show us that the military is not just there for show, it's there for use. As I said in my oral remarks, it's there to be an instrument of policy. And it's no good if people just think, you might be toying with the idea of using things. People have to believe that you will use them under the certain circumstances. And this is why all of the contingencies that we have been highlighting here have been put on the table. The team around Putin wants us to think that Russia will in fact use tactical and intermediate nuclear weapons. This is part of the whole violation of the INF Treaty. I mean, we're coming up to the anniversary of the treaty next year, in fact, the treaty from 1987. In many respects, Putin and the people around him want us to go back to that mentality of 30 years ago, of believing that the only way to engage with Russia directly is in these military contexts. They want to be taken seriously and to be seen as a credible threat by us and by NATO. And again, credibility depends on making it very clear that this is not an idle threat. One of the biggest problems that the Russians perceived in their engagements with the United States prior to the war in Georgia in 2008 was that we did not take any of their threats seriously. When they established a red line about the expansion of NATO, we didn't believe them. In fact, in some meetings that some of us were in the past, we heard senior US officials say things like, well, the Russians will shout and they'll stamp their feet, but they won't do anything because they haven't in the past. This is in meetings that some of us in previous capacities took part in. The point was that they did not have the capacity to take military action in the past under Yeltsin and frankly under Gorbachev in the late period of the Soviet Union when the state was very much weakened. Putin wants to show that now the Russian military has that capacity. We didn't get the message in 2008, now we're getting the message. So the whole point of this is not to engage in a nuclear exchange, but is to make sure that we know that Russia means business. So we have got to actually have a different debate with Russia now about deterrence. We've got to make it very clear to people like Putin and those around him who are not military people, who have not been engaged in the past in conventional discussions, if one can call it that, of deterrence, who are not the members of the Politburo of the old Soviet military who understood how that kind of deterrence works, that this is actually unacceptable. And that just even toying with the idea of using tactical nukes in any kind of battlefield scenario will result in the most dire circumstances. So it's a very different debate that we need to be having with Russia than we have had before.
Well, thank you all. I think it's a very important issue about the lessons others draw from our actions or inactions that applies in all sorts of places. At some point, I want to explore the hybrid warfare and what that means for our own capabilities. In the interest of time, I'll yield to Ms. Davis for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And actually, that's probably an area that I wanted to go into as well. And just having you talk more about Russia's use of hybrid warfare, unconventional, more clever, all the what you had mentioned earlier, and is it true? I think part of it is to exert influence and go as far as they can without triggering Article 5. So then where are we? And could you speak to that? And obviously in terms of NATO and in terms of the European alliance, it's difficult to actually draw a line in this context, but take us a step further with it. Because the game has obviously changed, as you said, that there is a real difference in their capacity now, and yet we don't want to be drawn into something for the sake of being drawn into something to respond to their test. So,
let me begin, if I could, with Article 5, since you brought it up. This is the fifth article of the NATO treaty, and it says an attack on one shall be regarded as an attack on all. It's kind of foundational to NATO. Article 6 of the treaty actually goes on to define an attack. It's a far less well-known article. It's really worth getting out and reading. It's only 2 sentences long. but it defines an attack as air, sea, and land upon the forces or citizens of a NATO state. So that would have been really clear as a definition in the 1950s when the treaty was being constructed, implemented, and developed. Today, with particularly cyber, it becomes ambiguous. So when is a cyber event a cyber attack? Is it when your accounts are surveilled? Is it when your data is manipulated? Is it when the data is destroyed? Is it when you have a kinetic outcome? In other words, a cyber attack that destroys your ability to land aircraft, to move trains? When is a cyber attack occurring? Russia sees this ambiguity as an element in hybrid warfare, and I think that's a good starting place for NATO, is to think about what is an attack in a Article 5, Article 6 context, because cyber will be a big part of hybrid warfare. A second element will be unmarked soldiers, so-called little green men, typically moving across borders. The war game I just completed with the Center for New American Studies here explored that quite fully. And it's kind of special forces, but it includes this element of really taking off your military badges so that in the information campaign alongside it, as a state, you can deny that these are your soldiers. You can say, these are volunteers, these are former Chechen veterans who are on their vacation going into a nation. You build more ambiguity in the little green men. Alongside the cyber and the little green men comes the information campaign, which I just mentioned. Yeah. You deny everything. You say this is not state activity. We've seen this again and again, particularly in Ukraine in the Donbass region. So these kind of elements strung together present a real challenge in the NATO context, exactly as you bring up, Representative Davis, because it's difficult to make the call that we're under attack. And this potentially could be used against Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. A final factor I'll mention is the presence of Russian-speaking minorities and a Russian doctrine that says we will defend Russians wherever they are, and by the way, we'll define what a Russian is.
Admiral, I just wondered whether you felt that that NATO would likely be much more definite about where these tests would be responded to.
I think prior to Ukraine, I think I would have been more concerned. I think today, because of the way the Russians have, if you will, revealed their hands so dramatically in Ukraine and Crimea, I think the sensors are up in NATO. People are really watching this. And again, in the war game, which had a lot of European colleagues involved, we moved very quickly to respond to this. Dr. Farcus was at that war game as well and might like to address it.
Thank you very much, Admiral. Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the only thing I would add, I absolutely agree that the problem with the unconventional approach is the surprise and the ambiguity of what is an attack. I think the approach that we've taken with our allies, in particular in the NATO context, but also with the non-NATO periphery countries, is to try to strengthen their capacity. That's why this ERI money is actually really important, because some of that goes to the special operations training that we're doing with Baltic countries, again, with Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, all those periphery countries in NATO, as well as the ones outside. If we strengthen their ability to respond, obviously that will lower the likelihood that we will have to, as you said, respond to a Russian attack, an unconventional attack ourselves through NATO, that local forces can take care of it. And when I say local forces, I don't actually mean necessarily the military forces, although our soft folks are in there working with the military. We also need to look at the local police, the law enforcement authorities, National Guard. So part of the hybrid means that, unfortunately, as you know, it's hard for us because of our authorities. We need to be working closely with our State Department colleagues and mixing funding, if you will, to conduct the training that's required. So I think strengthening the allies is really important. And then another thing that I mentioned, and the Admiral mentioned, the information campaign. We've seen now that the State Department is setting up this new cell to address the messaging with regard to the counterterrorism effort that we're conducting with our allies and the need to get information out to counter the radical Islamist ideology. Well, I would argue that we need a similar cell like that to counter the Russian propaganda. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Dr. Hill.
I will pick up on what Dr. Farkas just said about the State Department cell, and I have to say, I'm afraid that I don't think that that will actually do the business that we need to be done. I think as we're all outlining here that this is a very sophisticated approach on the part of the Russian government, and we have to be very cognizant of how broad-ranging that is. And it again gets back to the very fact that Putin and the team around him, and again, we have to just bear in mind that it's not just Putin, it's a larger group of people, all have the same outlook and perspective as operatives. This is an unusual group of people that we're dealing with as world leaders and the inner circle. It's very hard to find some counterpart who is similar to this elsewhere. And then again, they're not military people. It's the coin of the careers has been dealing in a clandestine fashion and dissembling and dealing with information and misinformation. And, as Putin has always put it, working with people to manipulate situations. So they all think along these lines. It's not some character flaw, it's what they've been trained to do. And it's incredibly all-encompassing. When Putin thinks of an operation, he doesn't just think about the military aspects of this. As Admiral Stavridis has said, it's all aspects of cyber and it's political. The State Department, frankly, will be run around in circles if that's kind of the focal point of what we're doing. We don't have the capacity or the resources for this. Russia is engaged in the information space in creating a moral equivalency with the United States and with our allies at all different levels. You will find from public opinion polls across Europe, as well as in Russia itself, that everyone believes that we are engaged in exactly the same activities. Hybrid warfare is extraordinarily old. The Tsarist regime used to engage in hybrid warfare. All the discussions of the old great game between the British Empire and the Russian Empire back in the 19th century, these were all aspects of hybrid warfare, of clandestine operatives, running around trying to subvert regional leaders from the Indian Empire onwards. So everyone believes that we have been engaging this for some time. And in fact, what's different now is that the Russians have said that they're going to engage the United States and its allies in the same kind of tactics that they believe we have been doing. And I have to say that they firmly believe that we have been engaged in clandestine operations in a continuous fashion since the war in Afghanistan onwards. They don't believe that we stepped down at all at the end of the Cold War in terms of the kinds of operations that we've been doing. And in fact, they took the operations that we have launched in counterterrorism as just an affirmation that we have never really changed our operational perspective either. And also with having Edward Snowden sitting in Moscow, and it's not just for the propaganda value, they believe very firmly that we're engaged in exactly the same tactics that we are. Putin's viewpoint is that the United States lies. It spies on everybody. It engages in these kinds of activities. I'm a spy. Of course I engage in these activities and I don't lie. And so the whole point of the information war is to show that Russia and the United States are very similar and to kind of discredit us also in that environment. So we actually have to counter that on multiple levels. It's a all-encompassing political exercise. And it also requires other leaders, our allies in other European capitals, our media, the think tank world that I belong to and everyone else to be very cognizant of what we're dealing with. We all have to do our homework, both inside and outside government, in figuring out how to contend with this.
If I could, Mr. Chairman and Madam Congresswoman, just to counter a little bit on the point about the State Department can't actually compete with Russia. That is true, but I think what I'm proposing is a very important component of the overall approach towards Russia, which obviously in the U.S. context has to include private media, public-private ventures, et cetera. But I think what has been missing, and it was very frustrating for me when I was in the government, was an ability to share information with our allies, with our partners, and with the world writ large, based on our excellent intelligence sources. We just we're not very good at declassifying and reclassifying information. That's not propaganda. Showing pictures of what the Russians are doing. We did it a couple of times, and interestingly, the Open Skies Treaty was actually useful because, unlike satellites, that's unclassified data that's gleaned as a result of aircrafts that take pictures for the purposes of our treaty requirements. But in any event, I think that we can do more just by getting some information out. That's the minimum that the State Department could do and should do together with the intelligence community, but it should also be a push, not a pull. Not leaders like yourselves or executive branch members saying declassify that, but actually the intelligence community looking with the State Department, what should we declassify, not waiting for somebody to tell them to do it. So that's the only thing I wanted to point out there, that it's important that we share that information.
Thank y'all. We're now going to have to operate under the 5-minute rule to try to get to everybody. And I'll yield to the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. And I have a particular interest in what you're saying and doing because in September 1990, I visited as a tourist to Moscow. I was so hopeful, and I have studied Russian history and Russian culture. I really appreciate their contributions to the world. But it was startling. In 1990, it was like stepping back into 1917. And it was the end of a failed socialist era of empty stores, empty streets. But I was just so hopeful seeing the pre-1917 architecture. It was just awesome. And then the talented people. But it's just been what I was hoping for was a partnership between the people of Russia, Europe, the United States, for the betterment of the Russian people. But sadly, on subsequent visits across the country with my family, we saw the beginning of a free market society, a modern society, but it's evolved now, sadly, as indicated into an autocratic political system, a crony capitalist system of some type benefiting the elite. I'm still hopeful for the country, but and the Russian people. But what challenges we and they have? With that in mind, I have a question for Dr. Hill and Dr. Farcus. And actually, Dr. Hill, you've substantially already answered the question. But let me go to Dr. Farcus from your point of view, which is really interesting. But as chairman of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, Russia's ongoing information propaganda operation is of great concern. And I share the interest of the chairman. What do you believe DoD should do to better compete in a new sphere of hybrid warfare? And how do we counter Russia's information propaganda operations?
Thank you very much, Congressman Wilson. I think I've laid out some of the components already. So with regard to dealing with the hybrid, I think all of the special operations training that's ongoing, and there's also some assistance that's being provided to embassies on the strategic communications front, so helping ministries of defense communicate better within their society what they're doing, and I'm specifically thinking about Ukraine, where we've been pretty active helping our ambassador work with the Ukrainians. So we need to do more of that. I don't think, first and foremost, though, the strategic communications is the Department of Defense's responsibility, so I really do think that the State Department should take the lead on that, and DoD should be in support. But the Special Operations Forces have a special niche capability with their so-called MISS teams, these informational teams. They can help embassies work with foreign governments. The other thing, of course, is just in training them to be able to see when things are happening and changing on the ground. And there is an intel component there, so obviously the Department of Defense's intel capabilities need to be brought to bear on the situation. So I think those are the main components, aside from the ones that I already mentioned.
Can I just add to that mix? I think that's a good shopping list, but it's also cyber, as I hope I indicated. I think this is an area Russia is really moving rapidly, along with other nations around the world, and I think the ability to compete in that space is something we need to emphasize as well. Thanks.
Let me just add one small point, that there is a very important role that our armed services can still keep playing through professional level exchanges with Russia. Although we should not be doing any of the things that Dr. Farkas warned us against in terms of some of the weaponry issues and some of the joint ventures that we've engaged in previously, Those professional level contacts are still extraordinarily important, especially for strategic communications. It's messaging. Because just as you said at the very beginning, we do not believe that Russia is any kind of implacable foe or enemy. What we have a problem with is the particular conduct and posture of the current Russian government and the way that they want to seek to use the military as a tool in their foreign policy. We have to make it very clear that there is still a different possibility ahead of us for a different kind of relationship, as we've already said, on many issues where we have mutual interest. And those professional level contacts are very important in emphasizing that. There's a great deal of respect for the US Armed Services among the Russian military, and we should capitalize upon that when we communicate with them.
And I've actually seen the benefit of people to people, too. In my community of Central South Carolina, we have a very thriving, assimilating Russian-American population we have many visitors coming from Russia, and hopefully they see the positive society we are. Thank you. My time is up.
Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. Admiral Stavridis, in your written statement, you mentioned that Russian submarine activity has risen to a level not seen since the Cold War days. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. If you look back at the Cold War, we saw, if you will, the hunt for Red October. We saw vast armadas of undersea forces playing cat and mouse games throughout the Arctic, through the Mediterranean, through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap in particular, as well as peripheral kinds of encounters, both under the ice and at the very bottom of the pole as well. So that diminished significantly as we came out of the Cold War. Now I would say we're back up to a level of activity that I would say is probably 70 to 80% of what we saw during Cold War times. And that implies more patrols coming closer to the United States, more probing kinds of activities. As you're well aware, this gets into highly classified information quite rapidly, but I think I'll close there and say that a closed session briefing on this might be of great interest to the members.
Thank you. And just, again, in your testimony, you talked about, again, the change that's happening in the landscape there in terms of military buildup, and that I think your term is, unfortunately, we're not currently configured to detect and respond to these types of moves in a robust and immediate military fashion. Again, you talked about ground troops and air assets that need to be boosted. Can you talk a little bit about naval response? Again, on sea power, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about the pivot to Asia Pacific, and we've had some of those briefings that you've mentioned earlier, but I guess, could you talk about that configuration?
I can. In terms of the Russian fleet, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, it's not a huge fleet. It's 270-ish kind of ships, but its submarine force in particular is extremely high-tech and extremely capable and is a real instrument that is being used most aggressively at this point. If we look at the building programs, what's on the ways and what the Russians communicate to us about what they're going to build, they're going to increase the conventional surface force as well quite significantly. So we're seeing robust activity, particularly in the subsurface venue, and it's less about the platform and more about the uses to which they're being put, which again are much more aggressive than we've seen really in a decade. Did you want to add something, Evelyn?
We don't have a lot of time here, and so the laydown that we have been looking at for the last 10 years in terms of shifting assets to Guam and other parts. I guess that's the question I was sort of,
Got you. Sir, I would say the Pacific pivot made some sense 2 to 3 years ago. I think at this point we ought to be reassessing that as a theory, recognizing that the United States is a global power and we have global interests, of course. But as I look at the strategic landscape of the moment, I would say it is a good time to be reassessing whether we want to shift a significant portion of the fleet into the Pacific.
And lastly, the Russians have about 42 icebreakers sort of up in the Arctic, and as Mr. Garamendi has been working hard on the Coast Guard subcommittee, you know, we're definitely struggling to get up to speed. I was wondering if you could just sort of comment on on that issue.
The Russians, as you know, are extremely robust in the Arctic. They have a huge number of icebreakers. We have a total of 1 operational icebreaker. China has many more than we do. This is something that needs to be corrected. I would invite the committee to read into the record the article I just wrote with General Schwartz about a solution for icebreakers. There is no question that the high north is going to be an area in which we need to be much better, and icebreakers have to be part of that.
Marcus, I have 40 seconds left. I don't know if you want to jump in on any of these issues.
I think really just to say that the submarine force is an area that the Russians have emphasized in their modernization as opposed to the surface fleet. Most of their modernization is very focused, and the missiles are also something that the missile capability they've improved, and then as the Admiral mentioned, it's what they could do. So we need to have good situational awareness, and I think, again, the submarine fleet. The only other thing I would add is that the Russian fleet, of course, is also in the Pacific, and our Pacific forces are watching them closely there as well.
And just one point, because China came up, that Russia is not just thinking about the United States as a long-term threat in the Arctic. For Russia, the Arctic and the Asia-Pacific theaters, maritime theaters, are connected. I mean, they're literally connected physically. And Russia is worried about Chinese, Korean, and other incursions as the ice melts in the Arctic and shipping opens. Because for Russia, this is about their commercial fleet, not just about their military posture in the Arctic. So I think we have to have a very broad-ranging discussion of the Arctic, not just from our own perspective.
Thank you. Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Admiral Stavridis, I'm especially grateful to you for your lifelong service to freedom, and appreciate you being here. With that, I would like to direct my first question to you, and that is, how important do you think it is for U.S. national security concerns to cooperate between the U.S. government, the United States Congress, and the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council? That's sort of a broad question, I know, but...
It is. I have spoken and thought a great deal about this. I, for one, am a strong supporter of Ukraine. I think it is an important nation. It's a big nation, and it's at play in terms of either falling into a Russian orbit, that's obviously the desire of President Putin, or fulfilling an opportunity for a transatlantic relationship, a future grounded in the European Union, in economics with Europe. It is highly to the interest of the United States that that competition move Ukraine in a direction of the West.
Yeah.
How can we do that the best? Through mechanisms as you're describing, through financial support, and I would argue through carefully crafted military support to the Ukrainian military, which I think is not destabilizing, but would in fact have a deterrent effect on Russia.
Yeah. Well, couldn't agree with you more. Let me shift gears in a completely different subject. I was a little discomfited, I suppose, is an understatement at some of the comments of Russian General Slipchenko here some time back in his cooperation with Iran and their electromagnetic pulse ambitions and their military doctrine, passive defense, on how they would be able to resist countries such as ours. And they mentioned electromagnetic pulse there 22 different times. What is your own understanding of Russia's EMP offensive capability, and what implications does that have for us, both directly and in their cooperation with Iran?
Again, without broaching into classified information, I'll confine myself to say Russia has a significant EMP, electromagnetic pulse capability. It could be devastating in the United States. It's a mechanism wherein nuclear blast at the right level can knock out an enormous amount of our cyber capability. Some have referred to this as the event that causes the cyber Pearl Harbor. This is a significant challenge for us. The fact that Russia would even have conversations about that with Iran is very disconcerting, because this is the way a rogue nation could use only 1 or 2 nuclear weapons to impact dramatically a large society like the United States. I'll close on Russia and Iran by pointing out that today we see the fulfillment of the sale of the S-300 anti-air warfare system, highly prized by the Iranians. I think we, unfortunately, will see nothing but further cooperation between Russia and Iran in a variety of spheres.
Well, obviously I'm glad you're on our side, and I hope your voice is carried far and wide. If I could shift gears, Dr. Farcus and Dr. Hill, I'll point this to both of you related to how increasing our assistance to the European allies will affect Russia's behavior in Syria. You know, there are a lot of folks at this point that have thought, well, with Assad being in power, there's no real chance of us dealing with anything of consequence there. But will Putin double down, or will he begin to find his resources growing thin? What impact can we still have there, and especially with Russia's obvious support for the Syrian regime?
Yes, just quickly on this, because it links into Admiral Stavridis' response to you about Iran. Russia has not intervened in Syria just because of us. Russia sees that the order in the Middle East is completely broken down now, the order established since Suez in 1956. And it wants to make sure that it has some say there because it has a whole set of interests, including relationships with Iran, with Egypt, with Israel, and many of the other players that we also have close relationship with. It also has a lot of tensions with countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and now, of course, with Turkey as a result of the incident back in last November. So Russia actually has a very tall order on its hands here with the intervention. It actually needs the United States to help it get out of what could potentially be a quagmire on the military side into some kind of negotiation. Its starting point is obviously to keep Assad in place and some semblance of the Syrian state, which is where it's pushing us towards right now. But Russia seeks a balance of power in the Middle East that will protect its interests as well. So we do actually still have some leverage there, as long as we can remember that it's not all about us in the case of Syria.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you.
Thank you. Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your wisdom and your service. Under the leadership of the chairman, I was able to visit Ukraine and Eastern Europe a few months ago and last year. And I was struck by the enthusiasm that the Eastern European countries shared at having us participate in drills. We had tank drills going on. We were very enthusiastically positioning aircraft. The military talked excitedly about extending our plans to counter a Russian invasion further east with our new NATO allies. And to be perfectly honest, I was shocked at how little we were doing to counter the Russian hybrid warfare threat. And it reminded me of what it must have been like to see France releasing excited press releases about their reinforcements to the Maginot Line when Germany is building tanks. And so when you look at the ERI and where we're putting our resources, because we obviously, as we all know, live in a resource-constrained environment, I just find it hard to believe that we're making smart strategic decisions when we're supporting all these tank drills at the necessary expense of expansions in our cyber warfare and other hybrid warfare and special operations and other things like that. So I was wondering if you could comment on that a bit and speak specifically not just to the need to address hybrid warfare, but at the right balance we need to strike with our resources.
If I could just quickly on this, I think part of what is important to bear in mind is that the base budget also addresses the hybrid threat. So the special operations community, and I give General Votel a lot of credit because he turned around very quickly and came up with a plan to address Russia. And I actually suggest that the committee invite him, well, now his successor, to brief you on their plans to address the Russia threat, because they understood very quickly what was going on in the aftermath of Crimea, and I would say within the department responded very relatively rapidly for the department. So there is money in their base budget, and in the U.S. European Command, they have turned around and they're already doing a lot of training. So they have been doing training in other countries, not just in Ukraine. In Ukraine, as you noted, they're just starting, but they actually have a jump ahead. They've already been working in the Baltics and Georgia and other places. So I think the base budget has some money there. It's not necessarily a question of money, because what the Special Operations Forces do in terms of building that resiliency internally doesn't cost as much, frankly, as the important exercises that ERI funds for us to demonstrate to the Russians that we will be ready, that we will respond as a unified alliance if they take military action towards us. So I think it's hard to compare the dollars because you just need more dollars to do the conventional stuff, whereas the unconventional stuff generally doesn't cost as much.
Right, but if Russia is beating us in the unconventional side, then does it really matter whether we're training 3 tank battalions or 5? Is that really an effective deterrent? Dr. Hill, perhaps you could comment on that.
It's really about the way that we approach this issue. I mean, one of the reasons that we see that Russia's been beating us in this regard is because they've had a very strong sense of purpose and focus. We've made a lot of mistakes in kind of miscalculating Russia's intent. And that's kind of something that has now come to bite us, frankly, since the war in Georgia. We saw that as a one-off. We were taken by surprise by Crimea. We didn't foresee what they were going to do in Syria, not because we didn't see them moving material and equipment in Syria, it's because we weren't able to anticipate what they might be doing. As we've heard, however, that our senses are up now in NATO and elsewhere. And I think what we have to do overall is posture ourselves in terms of analysis as well. It's not just an issue of intelligence and collecting intelligence, it's how we think about this issue. So that's going to be a key element. And I have to say that DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, has been gutted over the last several years in terms of its work on Russia, because people have been redeployed from what was seen as not a priority area onto other areas, the war on terrorism and elsewhere, which of course have been important. So we have to basically put resources behind our analysis again.
So quickly, Dr. Hill and Dr. Farkas, would you agree with Admiral Stavridis' admonishment that we should re-examine the pivot to Asia and to the Pacific?
We definitely need a more holistic approach. When Putin gets up every day, he thinks about the huge Russian landmass. He is not the head of a second-rate regional power. He's the head of a multi-regional power, and we have to look at Russia in that context and our own global posture,
And
as
Dr.
the Admiral
Farkas, would
said.
you agree with that?
I would just say that we need to bear in mind now that Russia is the immediate threat. And so that probably does have some implications for the pivot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Admiral, I just got to, what's your answer to Mr. Moulton's question about this conventional versus hybrid? There are some people who believe that ERI will make our allies feel better, but it's not going to have any effect at all on Putin.
I lean toward solutions that are cyber, special forces, unmanned vehicles. I think what is in the cusp between the two is battlefield capability that's anti-armor, anti-tank. That kind of lethal distributed force, I think, has a role to play that kind of falls in between the two categories. But I think a battalion, armor, heavy tanks, I think is unlikely to be the solution there.
Thank you. Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your thoughtful testimony. You testified earlier that despite the severe economic challenges that Russia faces, they've increased their defense spending by 25% in the last 2 years. Meanwhile, the U.S. has had continued discussions about defense sequestration, which unfortunately includes significant reductions in Army end strength. I want to look forward. As we're approaching a transition of administrations, what policy changes in our defense strategy do you think are needed to adequately counter Russia's recent changes in its national security strategy? I'm particularly interested in Army end strength, in cyber, and also, you noted this before, reassessing the so-called pivot to Asia.
I'll start off. I'm sure my colleagues have something to add. You mentioned a couple of things. I'm a supporter of the recent Army Future Commission that's just come out, headed by my former colleague and very good friend, General Carter Ham. I think that's spot on and lays out the numbers, I think, appropriately. In very round numbers, I think an Army that's about 1 million is what's needed between active, reserve, and guard. In terms of cyber, I think it's time to add significant capability and, in fact, to examine the question of whether or not the nation needs a cyber force. We have an Army, a Navy, an Air Force, a Coast Guard, a Marine Corps, et cetera. I think it's high time to think about a cyber force. Small, a few thousand, but to grow. The analog would be the Air Force of 100 years ago, which didn't exist. But we gradually came to understand we needed one. I think that's a conversation that we need to be having now. I do think we'll continue to see an emphasis on maritime and air activity globally. And in terms of the pivot, I want to make sure we are all on the same sheet of music here. in that the world is big and global and complicated. There's no simple answer of, gee, we should pivot to Asia or not. We have global responsibilities, but what we have seen of late in Europe and in the Levant and the Near Middle East causes me to think we ought to be re-examining a huge shift of forces to the Pacific. Thanks.
Dr. Farkas?
Well, I've gotten to where I am today generally by agreeing with Admiral Stavridis. So I agree with everything that he said. And the only other thing I would point out, in addition to my earlier comment about the base budget funding also a lot of these activities, the Deputy Secretary of Defense has this third offset, and there's a slice of money that he's requesting also in this budget, in this new budget request, which addresses critical capabilities that we need to develop so that we can stay ahead of our competitors, Russia and China specifically. And I would mention in that context that they are looking at, and I probably can't get into it too much more, but at cyber capabilities, cyber teams, and things like that. So there are other elements of the budget that do address the unconventional threat as well.
Dr. Hill?
I think what we have to bear in mind, based on all the things that we've been talking today, that whatever we do, we have to make sure that we have flexibility and adaptability in any of the mechanisms. Part of our problem is we tend to fixate on big budgets and big issues of doctrine, and often it makes it very difficult then for us to change course as circumstances change. I mean, this is the problem of being fixated on something like the pivot to Asia, or frankly on thinking solely about the war on terrorism, or thinking of things in terms of old challenges. Russia may be the current and present threat, and Russia has actually never really changed its posture toward the United States. Instead of dealing with many of the other threats that also face Russia, frankly, the United States is not, let's be frank about it, Russia's main threat over the longer term. There's all the transnational threats that we are worried about, Russia is too. So we have to actually move in a direction in which we change that calculus for Russia also, so that they change their minds about thinking of us as a threat. That requires some pretty astute diplomacy, including by the Pentagon, not just by the State Department and our other interactions. And we have to make sure that we don't get ourselves fixated on just the nature of the threat as it is. So we need as many flexible mechanisms as possible, and we need to really think to ourselves about how we adapt, not pivot one way or the other. So we have to be very careful that whatever we do, as I think Admiral Stavridis and Dr. Farkas are saying, not to then fixate on Russia, the Middle East and the Levant as well, to have a holistic approach and figure out how everything will fit together.
Thank you. My time is about to expire. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Takai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Farkas, you have stated publicly that your support for defensive, legal assistance in the Ukraine was not supported within the Department of Defense. How should the committee assess the department's request to increase resources to deter Russia? Can you discuss the divergent views with the department and the administration on U.S. policy towards Russia?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. I think, as I mentioned in my written testimony and in my oral statement, that the countries around Russia's periphery, they have requested lethal defensive equipment, specifically anti-tank weapons, the Javelin system. And thus far, the administration has not seen the need to provide this equipment to those countries, but I believe that it would be an important potential deterrent to Russia. And again, because it's defensive in nature, I don't believe that it would cause some kind of escalation dynamic that would be uncontrollable and lead to the United States getting drawn into the conflict in Ukraine. So I do believe strongly that we should make that system available to those countries. As far as the discussion about the Russia threat, I think you are hearing a chorus of voices, starting with, as I mentioned earlier, Secretary Carter talking about the Russia threat, as well as Deputy Secretary Work, who has really rolled up his sleeves and has been actively pushing items in the budget for a while now to address the Russia threat. So I think you're hearing one strong voice coming out of the Department of Defense and the administration writ large. but it's not the voice that matters. And in fact, sometimes if you talk too loudly, your strategy can backfire. It's more important what we do. And that's why I talked about across the board, we don't need to get into a confrontational dynamic with Russia. And indeed, there are places where we need to talk to Russia. And I don't want to veer too far off your question topic, but on the strategic and some of the more dangerous elements of our relationship, we actually have to re-engage in a discussion.
Okay, so Dr. Farkas, again, what lessons has the conflict in Ukraine taught us about our own shortfalls, and how would providing Ukraine with defensive legal assistance, you mentioned the Javelin, change the playing field on the ground in eastern Ukraine?
Well, I think, Congressman, we covered a lot of the ways that we've learned. You know, we were quite shocked, first of all, on the diplomatic front, that the Russian government took the fact that the Ukraine was interested in joining the European Union as such an assault on their foreign policy, and that they reacted the way that they did, that they took the opportunity of, of the failed arrangement where the Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, fled, and they took that opportunity to go in and seize Crimea. I think the thing that hasn't been mentioned, or maybe not mentioned sufficiently, is intelligence. And again, I think I want to elaborate a little bit on what Dr. Hill said. I found it shocking in the administration. I mean, it wasn't shocking, but it was disappointing. We have actually a lot of very good intelligence on Russia, but we do not have sufficient analysts, we do not have sufficient resources to get that information processed and get it out to the policymakers fast enough. And so I really believe that we need more analysts on the case. The other thing that we found was the lack of ISR. I mean, this is obviously this committee is dealing with that issue all the time in many different contexts, but we need more ISR for the U.S. European Command. Every interagency meeting we were in, when we talked about what can we do, there was always this discussion of, well, what's going on? And, you know, the satellite capability is one thing, but we really need to have the eyes on all the time. And so that's an area where I do believe we need to make sure that we have sufficient resources. And of course, we could provide those resources to the Ukrainians as well.
Okay, Dr. Hill, is it fair to suggest that President Putin expects that the West will turn a blind eye to Russian aggression and continue to cooperate with Russia? And what do our allies and partners in the region need from the United States?
I think that President Putin certainly did think that there was a strong possibility that we might turn a blind eye. This was one of his lessons that he took away from Georgia. He took the lack of a robust response to this as a sign that we weren't really serious. All of the questions that we're talking about today from our own perspective are questions that are being asked in Moscow about their own perspective in terms of analysis and intelligence and their posture, all aimed against deterring us. Putin has been seeking to exploit as many fissures as possible between us and our allies. And this is one area where I have something of a slight disagreement with Dr. Farkas about we have to be very careful when we're discussing support for Ukraine and elsewhere about keeping unity with our European allies. This is really a very key element about changing those expectations that we will get back to business as usual with Russia.
Okay, my time is up, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson?
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and also the ranking member for holding this important hearing. I'm encouraged by the testimony today. It matches a lot of the analysis that myself and others have been doing here very recently. In fact, we're going to be introducing a bill this week that is surrounding the land forces and the need to stop the drawdown. Admiral, thank you for your comments as far as ensuring that we keep the land forces strong. Our bill will essentially stop this drawdown, keep the land forces about 1,035,000 for the Army and the total Army. And I think that's really important when you compare it to what the current plan is right now. The administration's intent is to go to 450 in the active Army, 335 in the Army National Guard, and then under 200,000 in the Army Reserve for a total of 977. Admiral, in your comments, and actually to all the panelists in your comments earlier, I think you're making a strong case for deterrence, and in addition, mention about the Armored Brigade and the Combat Aviation Brigade in Europe. I think that the current situation warrants that. But starting with you, Admiral, I'd like you to comment on, first of all, if you have any general comments about our efforts. It is bipartisan. We're in double figures now. Sergeant Major Walls, I appreciate his support, and we have the support of Chairman, which is very important. But I'm interested to hear your comment, even beyond homeland defense and deterrence, the criticality from your experience of the ability to strategically maneuver. And here I'm talking about the Joint Global Response Force that we hope will send a message once we fully restore it in terms of helping us with coercive diplomacy, and then how that CONOP then develops into early on forces, campaign forces if necessary, command and control, sustainment, consolidation of gains, and effective transition, which we've struggled with over the last 15 years, and how important keeping the land forces strong is to that particular CONOP.
Happy to comment on that. And, you know, I wouldn't be doing my job as a retired admiral if I didn't say the words Marine Corps at this point. And I know you would count them
Absolutely, and that is in our
strongly
bill.
this.
And,
Absolutely. And I think I was happy to see their force levels remain strong in this budget that will be submitted to the committee in the Hill. I think the two need to fit together. And General Ham and I have had a lot of conversations about this, and this is where the ability to use the Marine Corps in and around that construct of the really heavy Army piece, I think, is critical to your bill. And that would be the piece of advice I would give, is that it ought to be very holistic. It sounds like it is in terms of integrating Marine efforts alongside the maritime and the air that have to go with it.
Yeah, appreciate that. In fact, just for clarification, the United States Marine Corps and Marine Corps Reserve are both contained inside this bill to stop the drawdown. Fully agree. In fact, my experience being an infantry commander, spent a lot of time with Marines, particularly in northern Iraq, as we were on a flank with each other at Nineveh and Anbar province. So, and then for the other panelists for comments on this.
Just very quickly, if I could, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Hill. On the Marine Corps, it's an excellent point that the Admiral makes. The Department of Defense has relied heavily on the Black Sea Rotational Force in that area, the periphery area, and the NATO Balkan countries to provide important readiness training and also preparation for the Georgian forces to deploy with us to Afghanistan, where, as you know, they're the #2 troop contributor. So I do think the Marine Corps is an important component. And as I mentioned in my written statement, aside from mentioning the aviation brigade, I also think that we really need to keep an eye on readiness and end strength so that we don't end up having a hollow force because we're stretching the Army too thin.
Just one very small point which picks up on the truncated response to Congressman Takai as well. It's very important, as Dr. Farkas has said, to keep our allies in mind here and to also make sure that whatever we're doing is also complemented by our military interactions with them as well. Because part of the deterrent effect will be us working in lockstep, as we have in the past, with our NATO allies and other partners. And all of this interoperability, maneuverability of the forces overall is extremely important, as I think Admiral Stavridis has been making clear as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. Some have attributed the increase in hybrid warfare across the globe to the inability of the West, specifically the U.S. and Europe, to find a way to integrate Russia and other rising powers, the BRIC nations, for instance, Brazil, India, and China, and Russia, the inability to find a way of integrating those rising powers into the international order. I'm thinking, with that in mind, the extent to which countries like Russia are using gray zone campaigns to grab more influence and shift the terms of regional orders is not really surprising. Do you have any suggestions as to how we can provide a more shared sense of ownership and a greater stake in the international order or system so that rising powers will be inclined to shape international politics without resorting to gray zone aggression?
I think that's a very interesting question, and I think its premise is roughly right, which is to say that part of why there's an increase in gray zone activity or hybrid warfare, or here I'd really, Congressman, use the term asymmetric warfare, is partly a sense of exclusion from normal mechanisms. It is also, however, attributable to technology. In other words, tools are available in cyber, in social networks, in information that allow smaller, less advantaged groups to engage in these kind of activities. So it's a combination of the two things. It's interesting you mentioned the BRICS, because I think these are extraordinarily different cases. Brazil is a mega power, which I do not think feels excluded from the international order, but suffers from a great deal of internal challenges economically. With Brazil, I think the prescription is to engage them fully using economic leverage to pull them into the global system. India, I think, represents our best potential partner going forward in this century. I think a U.S.-Indian relationship is one that will be critically important, and here we have to listen, pay more attention, have more exercises, more engagement with our Indian colleagues. China, I think we're actually managing the rise of China reasonably well, and you see China engaging in relatively responsible ways in the international order. It's really Russia that's the outlier here. And I do want to pick up on your point, which is to say that all the things we've talked about today, which are confrontational with Russia, must include a component of collaboration, of dialogue. We can't afford to stumble backward into a Cold War. We should cooperate where we can. We should confront where we must. And I think if we use that combination of deterrence, hard power, and soft power tools, that's our best bet at precluding a future of truly open conflict with Russia. It's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farkas.
Thank you for the excellent question, actually. I mean, I think one answer is, of course, to be more inclusive, perhaps in the institutional context. So I'm thinking of UN Security Council, et cetera. These are items that have been up for discussion for a long time, looking at the composition of that council. But I think otherwise, as the Admiral said, it's really Russia that's the problem, and the type of means that they are using in order to assert themselves. So it's not that we oppose Russia having a special role in its periphery or in Europe writ large, or that we think Russia must become a member of every club that we're in rather than counterbalance us politically. It's the means that they're using that is problematic for us. And so how to get them to not use those means is really the subject of my testimony, whereby what I think we need to do is demonstrate to them that those means won't work. And that's sort of the shortest answer I can give you.
All right, and Dr. Hill, I wish I could hear from you on that point, but let me ask you this. What sort of relationship do you believe Putin is looking for with the West?
Actually, Putin is looking for the relationship with the West that you outlined in really what was an excellent question. He wants to be one of the chairmen of the board. I mean, he wants to be in the same kind of arrangement that Russia thinks that it has on the UN Security Council, which is, having basically a say in the global agenda and a right to veto things that it doesn't like. And the focal point right now has been in Europe and the European security order, but also now in the Middle East, where Russia sees the order breaking down. What we have to be able to do is kind of articulate a broader vision for Russia of seeing that the methods that they're using in Europe and the Middle East will actually be counterproductive for Russia in a much more global perspective. Russia has key interests in the Asia-Pacific. We've already mentioned the Arctic. And Russia's actually vulnerable in both of those theaters. And it's also vulnerable, frankly, in Central Asia, which is another area of its traditional interest. So we have to articulate a sense that if Russia wants to be on the board with the rest of us, then it has to play by rules that we all generally share, including, frankly, China. We have to engage Russia in different theaters and to show that there's actually an alternative way of getting of our attention and of being there present when we're discussing new rules of the game. So this is a real challenge. It's a diplomatic challenge, but I think it also requires us showing from the military perspective that we're talking about today that we mean business and that we will not accept those methods. And it's also important because the rest of the BRICS are watching. China, India, all the other rising powers are trying to see how we handle this relationship with Russia. So we should think about this crisis as a test, not just for Russia, but for how we want to set the tone for future engagement internationally.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Gabbard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Farkas, you talked about Russia being the most immediate threat to the United States, and I think you and the Admiral both touched on the question of whether or not we should be focusing resources on the Asia-Pacific or shifting that back towards the East. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the seeming conflict between the statements that you're making versus those we hear from others within defense, especially with regard to North Korea being our #1 threat, especially given the provocations that we've seen from them with the missile tests, the nuclear tests, their increased capabilities, the effect that is having on the region, South Korea looking to increase its missile defense capability with our help, the changing and growing dynamic in the Asia-Pacific region. The list goes on and on. Obviously, being from Hawaii, my home state, feels very directly the threat every time North Korea launches a missile test, conducts a nuclear test, recognizing that within their current capabilities, we fall significantly within range. So I wonder if you can argue that point on why you're right and those who say that North Korea is our #1 threat are wrong.
Thank you very much for the question. I worked, as I mentioned earlier, for the Senate Armed Services Committee and worked very hard and aggressively for Senator Levin at the time on North Korea. And in fact, in 2008, I went to North Korea, went to Yongbyon. So I agree with you 100%. The threat from North Korea is serious, and we need to be addressing it. But I don't think that it's at the same level as the threat that we're seeing from Russia right now in terms of the potential dangers we face with Russia. The capabilities that the Russian Federation has are far surpass the capabilities of the North Korean regime, and I think that we have the means to respond. We have the means to respond to both, but I think that to respond to Russia requires a bigger undertaking. So I hate, though, to rank threats. They're both threats. But I emphasize the Russian one because it's here and now. It's in our face. We really need to understand it because there is a real danger that if we don't stand firm against Putin, he will take the opportunity to use military force again, as he did in Georgia, as he did in Ukraine, even before that in Moldova, as he did in Syria. He'll be tempted to use it again. And of course, the worst case for us would be if he used it against a NATO ally, or of course, God forbid, against us, although in both cases, I don't think it's probable, but it's still, for the Department of Defense, obviously prudent to worry about the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
So I think that is the worst case scenario, but clearly I don't mean to say that the North Korean threat is not important, and we need to focus on that as well. We can't pick among, and I think the ranking thing is a little bit overdone.
Yeah.
Because of course terrorism is the immediate and urgent, and
No,
for the
I agree.
Europeans, terrorism and immigration. So
Yeah.
the Admiral perhaps would
I'd
elaborate.
only add to that, I have written extensively and have said that North Korea is the most dangerous country in the world.
Yeah.
And I think they are in a tactical sense. I think Russia, because of its throw weight and its strategic play, represents a significant strategic challenge for the United States, if that helps how we articulate it. But I would not in any way understate the risks on the Korean Peninsula in particular.
Thank you. Thank you both. Dr. Hill, building a little bit off of that, and also something you said earlier about how the U.S. and Russia are, quote, on a long-term collision course, in particular as it relates to Syria. I'm just wondering if you can expand on that a little bit and why you believe that's the case.
In the case of Syria, Russia has very long-standing interests. This is a relationship that dates back to the Soviet era. The relationship preceded Bashar Assad. It was a relationship that Russia also established with his father. They are very interested in propping up the regime and also keeping the state of Syria together. This is not a sideshow for Russia. It's actually a domestic foreign policy issue. Russia has exactly the same concerns as all of the other neighboring states do and European states about the influence of extremism on its domestic politics. Yeah. Russia is the largest indigenous Muslim population of any European country, and we do think of Russia as a European country, and Moscow has the largest Muslim population in its capital. And this is an indigenous Russian population. The Russian government have recently stated that they're following 2,800 foreign fighters from Russia and Syria. There are foreign fighters from the neighboring countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus. So Russia has, all the questions that we have about the future of Syria, and they believe that keeping the Syrian state together with someone like Assad, a strongman at the head, is the best solution for them. Yeah. We've been on a collision course because obviously we have not had the same starting point. We have the same end point of wanting to keep some semblance of the Syrian state together, but we did not want to begin with Assad. Yeah. So Russia has, as we've been discussing today, decided to use the military as a blunt instrument in foreign policy to force us to start from the same point as Russia has in determining the future of Syria.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with your assessment of that and remain concerned about this head-to-head collision path that we are on between the U.S. and Russia, specifically because of that difference and those diametrically opposed objectives in Syria. Thank you.
So do you think it's possible for the U.S. and Russia to reach a quote-unquote acceptable agreement on Syria?
I actually do. I think it'll take a lot of work, however, because it's, as we've been saying all the way along, this is not a two-way game. It's not between the U.S. and Russia by any stretch of the imagination. Russia has differences not just with the United States, but with Turkey, which are very clearly expressed now in very risky and very dangerous terms. Russia has a difference of opinion with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar and other Gulf states. And frankly, Russia also has a difference of opinion with Iran. We have to be very careful here to make sure that we're clear that Russia has not jumped into the sectarian divide in the Middle East by any stretch. Russia's Muslim population are predominantly Sunni, but it also does have a Shia population inside of its own territory and on its periphery. And Russia doesn't want to be part of a religious war. It wants to actually stop these. Russia wants to see some kind of new balance of power in the Middle East. It doesn't want to see Iran actually get the upper hand over other Middle East players either. So in many respects, Russia and the United States are on very much the same page. We want stability. We want a new order in the Middle East. We want to actually protect some of the same regional players. Russia is just as concerned about the fate of Israel as we are now. It's a very different relationship with Israel than it was during the Cold War for Russia. It's a very important bilateral relationship. So there's a lot of things that we can talk about here. We just have to get away from the idea that it's just a collision between the two of us over actually a country that we don't have any intrinsic interests in owning. Russia does not want to own Syria as a protectorate. It wants to eventually get out of Syria, maintaining its base and other interests there, but to see an order emerging around Syria in the Middle East. So I do think that we can do this. We just have to be clear-headed and do our homework.
May I add a comment, which is, I agree we can get to a diplomatic solution, but it will require us accepting Assad for some period of time, which will be difficult to swallow, given his level of atrocity against his own people. I take some comfort from the fact that in the Balkans, we had to cut a similar deal. Milosevic stayed in power, and in the end, Milosevic died in a jail cell in The Hague. But we will get there diplomatically. It'll require us to take a hard swallow on Assad.
Okay, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the three witnesses. Thank you for your very balanced assessment of the situation, particularly your desire to share with us what appears to be, in my view, trying to understand Russia, to look at this situation from the Russian perspective so that we have a better ability to decide what we want to do. I very much appreciate that. There's a whole series of issues. In fact, I'd like to pull you aside and share 10 gallons of coffee with you over the next 10 days. A couple of issues. One, it seems to me the ambiguity that NATO presently has with regard to little green men in the Baltics is troublesome. So if you could speak to that, should we not be clear as to what precisely would be a NATO incursion?
Thank you, sir. We talked a bit earlier about Article 5 and then the definition of an attack, which is Article 6, and the way warfare has changed and morphed. I think because of what's occurred in Ukraine, NATO is much more on alert, will work much harder to identify through intelligence surveillance, reconnaissance activities, and I think, frankly, I wouldn't want to speak for the Baltic states, but I am assured they would take a very aggressive posture, and I think they would immediately use lethal force, and I think that would be a salutary effect. So I think NATO has moved in its direction. I agree we should do this over 10 gallons of vodka.
Well, that would terminate conversation for sure. Any further comments about, should we be ambiguous about this, or should we be clear as to what a threat really is?
Yeah, the Admiral just whispered clear. And I think yes, clear. I mean, that's what our Baltic allies would like, and that's what we owe them. We are, as I mentioned earlier, doing a lot of work with our Special Operations Forces. We need to do more, though, to help law enforcement in the Baltic countries, and also the Balkan countries, Romania and Bulgaria.
I'm going to say thank you for that, but it seems to me we need clarity as to what is an incursion, what is an attack. Any ambiguity will lead to, I think, a very difficult situation. So I got two other things. You talked about cyber warfare. What agency in the United States government is responsible for a cyber attack on the United States?
This is a confused situation in our government. I'll give you kind of two answers to it and throw in a third. The Department of Homeland Security is broadly responsible. The National Security Agency, which is part of the Department of Defense, provides the tool sets, and I would argue will be where this response will occur. And the Department of Defense has a specific set of responsibilities to protect military capabilities, notably our strategic nuclear systems. So that's just the beginning, and would probably need 20 gallons of vodka to really get through the cyber structure in the government. But this is an area that I think this committee could profitably spend a great deal of time examining.
I asked the question for a specific reason, which is everybody's responsible, and therefore nobody has
Nobody is accountable as a result.
Mr. Chairman, we need to deal with this. We're talking about a foreign cyber attack. I noticed that the budget has a whole lot more money for cybersecurity, which I think they mean how to protect our databases. I think there's something far, far beyond that that we need to address, and that is, why would anybody that wants to do harm to the United States spend all their money on building a nuclear weapon for an EMT attack when you can simply hire a bunch of teenagers and take down the entire grid system, the electrical grid system in the United States?
You are right to emphasize the grid. Of all the things that are vulnerable, financial, health, military, the segment that is most vulnerable is our grid system.
36 seconds. Why are we engaging in a new nuclear arms race that will cost us $1 trillion?
The short answer is, in the 24 seconds, because Russia is expanding their modernization capability with an enormous focus on nuclear weapons, and they have a leader who frequently mentions that we should not forget that they have nuclear weapons. I think it is, unfortunately, a necessity for us.
Agreement from the...
I would agree with that. I mean, we have to deter Russia.
And we need to do that by spending $1 trillion on an entire new system.
Well, I'm not going to argue about the dollar amount, but I do think we need to keep our force modernized so that we can continue to deter Russia. As the Admiral said, unfortunately, that's the reality.
We also need to find a way of pushing back to arms control discussions, and particularly as we reach next year, the 30th anniversary of the Gorbachev-Reagan symmetry. Perhaps we need, to channel the cooler heads of that period as well. And
so there may be another path available to us.
There may be, correct.
I thought so. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
I'm going to prevail upon y'all for just a couple more questions, hopefully. Dr. Hill, I got to ask you about this. A line of argument is that Putin wanted to cooperate with us until the Balkans happened and we bombed, Syria, and we didn't listen to him on a couple other things, and then he went off in a completely different direction. Is that true, or is he always been who we see today?
I think it's the problem of understanding other people's threat perceptions and the environment in which they operate. I think it was always a very hard sell to persuade someone like Putin and the people around him that, we actually meant well towards Russia. This is somebody who was trained in a Cold War environment to be deeply suspicious about the United States. I don't think he's actually in any way intrinsically anti-American, but he's always deeply suspicious of threats to Russia. And the way that he has interpreted and read world events based on information that has been passed to him and also his own worldview and perspective is that beginning, frankly, in 2003 with the US invasion of Iraq, it isn't really to do necessarily with the Balkans, that we, the United States, have been in the business of regime change. And based on what he and others saw in the Balkans in the 1990s that Admiral Stavridis is referring to, that we might eventually get round to him and to Russia. Back in 1999, and I can say this with good authority because I was actually in Russia during the NATO bombing, across the whole spectrum of the Russian political system, people believed that if NATO could bomb Belgrade, that meant NATO could bomb Moscow. We might think that's preposterous. That was their threat perception. And since then, Putin and the people around him have talked themselves into seeing that everything that we do fits into that frame. And it's really been the pivotal point was the protests in Russia in 2011, 2012, where we laughed this off when Putin claimed that the State Department had been behind the protests, that the protests were being paid for by US non-governmental organizations, but he firmly believed it. Again, he believes that we've continued with active measures since the Cold War, that we've never stepped back. Okay. And so the problem has been how to persuade someone who thinks like that in actual fact this is not the case. So that's the challenge that we've had.
When he has some sort of or those people around him have some sort of self-interest to perpetuate this myth. Of course, one of the things that we have not talked about today is the use of assassination, which has also been in the news here recently. I would like to broaden out for just a second and ask each of you to address this. And actually, it's based on an article, Dr. Farcus, you had, that Putin is trying to rewrite the international rules because he sees the international order since the end of World War II as being developed by us for us. And so part of what's going on here is not just promoting strategic interests in this or that place, but a fundamental rewrite of the international order so it can be more to their advantage. Now, we hear the same thing on the Chinese, by the way, but if you would start and just address this briefly, if you could, this attempt not just to, again, protect their interests, but to change the whole ball game.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, Putin is trying to rewrite the rules, and that's precisely the problem that we have. The means that he uses run counter to the rules. So in his belief system, he believes that minority rights allow him to go in and seize territory. So to take territory in Georgia, he's occupying 20% of Georgia right now, to go into Ukraine and take Crimea and then do the military operations that he's conducting right now in the east. So in his view, he has the right to intervene in order to protect those Russians, and Dr. Hill mentioned that as well, the ethnic Russians. He also would like to prevent us from intervening in order to support peaceful transitions or not so peaceful transitions from autocratic, despotic rulers to democratic systems. So the Arab Springs, for example, the Arab Spring, you can take Tunisia, you can name any of them, but he was absolutely opposed to any kind of outside intervention, and he perceived them as being in the same model as the Iraq intervention, where we intervened and we got rid of Saddam Hussein. His view is he wants to intervene in order to protect the dictator, in order to keep the Saddam Hussein or the Bashar al-Assad in power. So it's a different understanding.
Because that's a way of protecting himself.
Right, and it's a different understanding of the balance between sovereignty and human and minority rights that we've had since the Second World War.
Can I just add to that, Mr. Chairman? One thing we haven't touched on greatly is domestic political concerns for Mr. Putin. And I don't need to tell a committee of politicians that that matters pretty deeply, how you're perceived, where your power base comes from. And so much of his appeal to the Russian people is tied into this idea of himself as a strong man. If you look at Russian history, they roll the cosmic dice. One time they get Ivan the Terrible, the next they get Peter the Great. One time they get Stalin, then they get a Gorbachev. The dice have landed definitively on Putin. He will continue to play that strong man card. He's got to win. He's got to be seen as winning, and he has to be seen as capable of pulling these levers of power. It's fundamental to who he is domestically, as well as all of the geopolitical points we've talked about today.
And Dr. Hill, in your comments also, one of y'all mentioned earlier, I noted, deflect public attention. Part of the reason he's more aggressive is to distract people. Again, an argument that is made about China as well. So if you could address this, change the international order question.
Yes, changing the international order is very much on the agenda for Putin and the team around him in Russia. I mean, I think, you know, as Dr. Farkas has been saying, there's been a very strong consensus in Russia, and I would say it actually has been since 1999 and the NATO bombing of Belgrade, that the order is not working for them, and that there needs to be some way of wresting a veto out of the international system, particularly in Europe, for Russia to block things that it does not like. In terms of the internal political situation in Russia now, Putin is actually in a more precarious position than he might seem from the perspective of his ratings. We're talking about 88 to 90% in public opinion. Some of this is real. It's based on Putin's long record as a Russian leader since 2000. He really has had a lot of signature achievements, especially in the economy and in terms of stability in the political system. The cosmic dice actually seem to have rolled into a good place as far as most Russians are concerned, and we should be really well aware of that. The problem is, and it's one that perhaps other politicians would envy, that there's no political alternative. And that's risky because the only alternative to Putin is Putin in the past. All of his ratings depend on how he performed prior to that opinion poll being taken. And in the past, Putin was actually seen to be lacking at different points. There'd be a crisis and his ratings would fall. If you look at the ratings of the political system, of the Russian government, and of the performance of the Russian economy and the state outside of Putin's performance, you see a very different picture. Russians are not happy with the way that their country is being governed. So Putin is the ultimate populist figure right now. He has to, at all times, appear to be in charge and in control. It's something, I guess, we're all familiar with in many other settings. So this is Putin's challenge. He has to show that if the economy is failing, that someone else is to blame. It's the United States, it's Western sanctions. And he's putting all of the spotlight onto military victories in Syria and in Ukraine, and into being the big international player. At a period when we're all bemoaning a lack of international leadership, Putin is trying to demonstrate it. It's not in the way that we would like, but it's now very important for his own validation, legitimacy, and ratings at home in Russia.
Okay. Let me ask one other thing. Admiral Stavridis, at the end of your written statement, you say we prevail by outthinking our opponents. Give us a grade. How are we doing at outthinking our opponents?
In the case of Russia, B- at best. What I was trying to get at there, Mr. Chairman, was not only the topics we've talked about today, but also using our ability to learn and understand the history, the culture, the language. We need to be capable of reaching across a divide like this, and that requires real intellectual capital. Scholars, students, analysts, we've touched on that a bit. We have volumes of data about Russia, but we're not very good at understanding and analyzing it. And oh, by the way, if you really want to understand Russia, go easy on the CIA report and go back to reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Lermontov and Pushkin and the great Russian writers. They tell us a lot about the situation we face today. That's what I was getting at in that comment.
Can we bring on the coffee and keep going?
Charles Hill wrote a book about understanding opponents based on its literature, which is what. But let me just take subset of the question to our responsibilities. Part of what we're trying to do is promote some reforms to help the Department of Defense be more agile in a very complex world. A lot of that is the thinking and that goes on within the military. If you were to put a couple items on our agenda to consider when it comes to improving the intellectual agility of our military, what would you have on that list?
Not speaking specifically to Russia, which I addressed a moment ago, but yeah, very broadly, I would say we need to continue to put an emphasis on graduate education. And I say that with a certain amount of self-servingness as the dean of a graduate school of international relations. But continuing to put emphasis, as Ike Skelton, who's over your left shoulder right there, built into this committee a sense of how can we educate our future leaders in the military, and that ought to happen at every level. If you want a practical proposal, I'd say take a look at the National Defense University and ask the question, why is that not a capstone to which all the service war colleges report, and build a structure that definitively puts education on the agenda where Chairman Skelton believed it should be. I think it still is taking some hits, if not below the waterline, then pretty close to it.
Okay, that's helpful. And Mr. Garamendi's right. We're going to need more coffee to finish these. Mr. Aguilar?
I don't want to stand in the way of the chairman and the panel having lunch either, so I will be very cautious here. I did want to pick up on the theme of aggression, and Dr. Hill, you just talked about Syria as well. At this moment, Russian-backed Syrian forces are working to encircle the rebel-held parts of Aleppo. Assad is on the cusp of a major victory, and thousands of civilians are fleeing. There's a serious concern that those in the city will stay and be cut off from food and other types of foreign aid. Because of the Russian aggression and interference, we're on the cusp of another siege in a heavily populated Syrian city. With Russia playing such a large role in this offensive, what would you recommend be done to counter the crisis, if anything? And do you think, what do you think are the implications of this offensive on our efforts to counter Russia in the future?
I think part of our problem is that it's not just a military issue here. It's, there's a certain psychological element to this. Putin and the people around him have been engaged in similar military operations, not just in their periphery, in Georgia and Ukraine, but within their own territory in Chechnya. And if you look back to 2 wars in Chechnya, beginning in 1994 in the Russian Federation, you can see a very clear focus on basically pursuing a goal no matter what to preserve the state. And Putin, I think, looks at Assad and sees Assad as being in the same situation that he, Vladimir Putin, was when he came into office in 2000, when the war on Chechnya had erupted again. And Putin was determined, no matter what the consequences were in terms of civilian casualties or the destruction of Chechnya's capital city, Grozny, to prevail. So Putin is pushing his forces behind Assad to make sure that Assad prevails. I'm afraid the civilian casualties are not really factoring into this in an operational way. So we have to figure out how to engage with Russia, not just in military ways, but to change that psychology, to show that in some respects this will have consequences for Russia as well, in the way that it's viewed in the Middle East and the way that it's viewed more globally. Because Russia now believes that the refugee problem, the civilian crisis, are somebody else's problem. They're Turkey's problem, they're the Lebanon's problem, the Jordan's problem, and they're now Europe's problem. And that is not something that they are going to step away from. If they're exporting that problem, that's not theirs to deal with. We have to show that civilian casualties actually matter, and that the broader psychology of this war will be very detrimental to Russia in the longer term, that they need to rethink the way that they are pursuing this.
If I could just add to that, as I said in my opening comments, I think, unfortunately, we have to do more militarily to support the Syrian opposition and work with our allies, and Secretary Carter is trying to do that right now, get some more, metal into the game, if you will. But it's as Dr. Hill mentioned, it's not just a military problem, and ultimately what we need against Russia is leverage. So if we can get it on the battlefield, great. If we can't get it only through military means, which I think is probably the case, we should look at other measures. So can we come up with a package of sanctions that we can implement with our Middle Eastern allies and partners against Russia? Because right now we have sanctions where we're sanctioning Russia in the Ukraine context, but perhaps there's something we can do to signal to Russia that what they're doing in Syria, the way they're waging the war, the disingenuousness, saying they're going after ISIS when they're not, the type of bombs they're using, the civilian casualties, et cetera, that's unacceptable. But we need to be looking for leverage ultimately.
I would only add that we have a couple unpalatable futures ahead if we're going to solve this diplomatically. One I've mentioned already, which is I think we are going to have to accept Assad for some period of time. The second one, which we haven't touched on, is a partition of Syria. I think that increasingly that may be part of the solution. That sounds quite unthinkable, but if you look back on the Balkans 20 years ago, you saw Yugoslavia break apart, really 30 years ago, erupt in war 20 years ago, and ultimately those problems were solved by partitioning, by accepting Milosevic for a period of time, and by working with the United States, with NATO, and with Russia collectively. I think there are some lessons there from history looking at the Balkans that may have to be applied. No one is going to walk away a complete winner from this process.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your testimony. Admiral Stavridis, it's good to see you again. I have a couple questions for you. The first is, as we talk about budget saving and downsizing all the time here, oftentimes a target is headquarters staff. There's discussion of bloated headquarters. And having worked at a COCOM, I see some value in the COCOM staff. And so I just wanted to ask for you to, just share your perspectives on how important it is to have the right size of a staff at the COCOM so that they're not an obvious target. Because if we get too small in those areas, then there's capabilities that are just not going to happen. And if you also have a comment on EUCOM separate from AFRICOM, because I think that's something that gets talked about, having 92 countries in your responsibility versus having that peeled off where you can really focus on the challenges you've all mentioned today. That's just my first question to you.
Sure. First of all, great to see you as well, and thanks for your service on our EUCOM staff. I think that the process of right-sizing our staffs is something that has to go on consistently. There has been an enormous growth in staffs, broadly speaking, over the last 20 years, including the Department of Defense, the NSC staff, and of course right here on Capitol Hill. It strikes me as we're in a world of rapid-moving information and technology, we ought to be able to do some level of consolidation. Having said that, I believe in the COCOM model, the combatant command model. I think it makes a great deal of sense, and it allows us to have the kind of regional specialization that I think is crucial. Whether or not EUCOM and AFRICOM ought to be remerged, I think at the moment that probably is not a good idea. It's worth examining that. More profitably, perhaps, looking at NORTHCOM and SOUTHCOM. There might be some synergies there that could be addressed. You could also look at TRANSCOM and DLA. So I think there are areas where mergers would make some sense. I wouldn't, at this minute, advocate one between EUCOM and AFRICOM. I do think we need to put downward pressure on staffs, but we need to do it in an informed way.
Great, thank you. I know you talked about in your testimony about moving Army forces out of Europe and how that's not been ideal, but we've also moved some air forces out of Europe as well. 81st Fighter Squadron closed down. First time we didn't have A-10s in Europe in decades, but now we're deploying them back to Europe, which I'm guessing is probably more costly for us to do that. So could you comment about the importance of our air assets there for deterrence and training as well?
Sure, and you mentioned the A-10. I think like a lot of people currently in uniform, I also am an A-10 fan. I think they are a simple, workable answer, and I think in a European context could be extremely important if we really went to the dark end of the spectrum. Certainly they could be useful in many other areas. I also am a big fan of special forces aircraft in Europe. We are moving, as you know, some of the V-22s in. at the end of the day, the good news about airplanes is you can fly them and they can move and they can come in. But there is a real power in having them present that allows you to deter and, again, at the dark end of the spectrum, conduct significant operations. So as I mentioned on land forces, I would also echo we ought to be looking again at cuts in the European theater on the air side.
Great, thanks. And last quick question, again, in the budget pressures, we're all often focused on making sure we have hard military power, but there's the soft engagement, which I believe is also valuable. And I was a professor at the Marshall Center, as you may know, and so just, again, as the former SACUR, can you just comment on the value of the Marshall Center and how that is important for the European theater in dealing with potential Russian aggression?
I can. Marshall Center Garmisch is an iconic example of what we talked about a moment ago that Chairman Skelton built into the system, which is education as a tool of national power that goes alongside it. It's where we create soft power. It's how we learn how to use hard power. Not only the Marshall Center, but really all of these regional centers, which are a pittance in the big scheme of things, I think are extraordinarily valuable to the department and to the nation.
Do you have any ideas? There's been discussions of consolidation of some of those centers. Do you have any perspective on that?
I think the budget savings are so minuscule that that probably does not make a great deal of sense.
Great, thanks. Now you're back, Mr. Chairman. Thanks so much.
This has been very helpful, and I'm very grateful to each of you for sharing your expertise with us today and some very complex, difficult issues that the country faces. So the hearing stands adjourned.